My name is Ramona Masacci. I'm an artist, a creator. I learned about modern monetary theory through Bernie Sanders' campaign. I wanted to understand his economic platform, which led me to his economic advisor, Stephanie Kelton. I started reading her work, and it intrinsically resonated with me. So I wanted everyone else to learn about it. I got together with my friends at Real Progressives, and we put together this book club. For 9 weeks, we read and discussed Stephanie Kelton's bestseller, The Deficit Myth. We started each session with passages from that week's chapter. Then a guest took questions from the attendees. You're about to watch the recording of the Q&A section. I would like to reintroduce Dr. Stephen Hale. Is a lecturer in economics at the University of Adelaide, where he has lectured in finance and macroeconomics since 2002. He is also a research scholar at the Institute of Sustainable Prosperity and the economist of the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group in Adelaide. You can find him on Twitter at Stephen Hale AUS. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ramona, and thanks for having me.
So our first question is from Patrick. Patrick, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Yeah. Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for being here this evening or this afternoon for you.
Hi, Patrick.
And Ramona, thanks as usual for having us here. So, Stephen, my question is, how would you compare Australia to the US in terms of how people view or accept MMT so far?
I think from what I know of the US, I think we're in more or less the same position. I was fortunate enough to have Stephanie over here visiting just over a year ago, just for 2 weeks. And she made such a difference over here. And of course, we have Professor Mitchell in Australia, who is a great economist as well. But Stephanie was in all the newspapers, on TV, on the radio, and it really made a huge difference. Of course, we've had a pandemic support, economic support package like many other countries too, which has helped to undermine the myth that the government needs to balance its budget or should be seeking to push the budget towards a surplus, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to fund dealing with the crisis. There were about 40 billion Australian dollars in private bank reserves last March. And the government announced that it was going to run a fiscal deficit of about $200 billion over the next year. Now, if people imagine that they had to go and tax these dollars or borrow these dollars before they could spend them, that would have been impossible, because there were fewer dollars in existence in the system than the government was planning to deficit spend. So that made a huge difference. I found myself on the media an enormous amount over the last year. Really, we started doing this, me and Phil Lorne and one or two others, because we thought we couldn't leave it all to Bill Mitchell, which is basically what modern monetary theory was in Australia, pretty much for many years. In terms of the political parties, our government is a conservative government, so they're not really interested, apart from to dismiss and distort and lie about the sorts of things we say and to misrepresent MMT. The governor of the central bank, the Reserve Bank here, much like the chairman of the Fed in the US, has mentioned MMT again in order to misinterpret it and try to dismiss it. Our main opposition party, the Labour Party, the leadership are not interested, and they're still talking about pay as you go, a bit like some Democrats still tend to do in the US. But young Labour all over the country in various states are adopting job guarantee proposals. And we've got furthest with the Australian Greens here, really. who, no disrespect to the American Greens, but the Australian Greens they're actually in federal parliament and in state parliaments and sometimes in coalition governments in states. So they have some degree of influence. So that's basically where we are in Australia.
Thank you, Stephen. Aaliyah has a question. You can unmute. Go ahead, Aaliyah. Okay, I'll ask for you. On page 225, Kelton talks about the purpose of taxes, to put a cap on the amount of money any one person or family could extract from the shared and interdependent economic activity of all Americans. I think many people's aversion to social programs is that the recipients don't deserve it, didn't earn it, etc. How can we explain that all economic activity is interdependent and thus should be shared? That's a good question.
That's a brilliant question, and it goes to the heart of what I regard as a state capture in the US by the rich. The US the US federal government was basically controlled by the elite in the US up until the Great Depression, up to the end of the 1920s. And it took 2 world wars, a pandemic, which they called Spanish flu in those days, although it didn't have much to do with Spain, and a Great Depression to change all that. And of course, the New Deal and FDR and everything else. So after the Second World War, things were very different in the US. Of course, there was much lower inequality. Inequality continued to fall until the 1970s. There was a different view about what the government could achieve and could help people to achieve. And that feeds into what Stephanie talks about in the book when she talks about the moonshot in the 1960s. And then somehow, partly because of a long campaign, which people like Milton Friedman had been working on to roll everything back from the late 1940s, partly because of a global economic crisis to do with a spike in inflation in the mid-1970s, partly because, I guess, a generation aged out. And from 1980 onwards, Stephanie talks about the Reagan Revolution, it all got rolled back again. And it's not just the deficit myth, that's an important part of it, but it's a whole series of myths which underlie neoliberalism or state capture by the rich. So there is the government can't do anything myth. The private sector is always more efficient than the government. The government is the problem, not the solution. There is the you get paid what you're worth myth, the notion that people get paid based on their productivity, which is demonstrably not true. There is the great the American dream of equal opportunity myth. Actually, there is less social mobility between low income and high income groups in the US than almost any other high income countries. And if you want to live the American dream, as a social scientist, I can't remember the name of, said in a TED talk, you should move to Denmark. That's where if you start off with a low level of income, you can end up with a high level of income. It's very difficult in the US, and a whole series of other myths as well, which are the result, as I said, of a long campaign and the rich and the influential taking advantage of a crisis in the 70s and then doubling down. And Stephanie talks about the democracy deficit. It goes both ways, really. Once you have a very unequal society, then, of course, the rich are dominant, particularly the way politics is funded in the US. And that biases policy to create even more inequality than before. So that inequality in the US, after it fell from the 1930s until the mid-70s, it has been continually rising since then, until we've ended up, as Stephanie says in the book, back in the 1920s again. with this view of the world where if you haven't been fortunate and you don't have a high level of income, then somehow it's your fault and you don't deserve society to help you, which of course is complete nonsense. It's distorted the way we see our fellow citizens. We see people as competitors. We financialize everything now. And I can remember even when I was a teenager, things were different. There was a much more, we tended to see other people in a more positive way than on average people do in our societies now. And we didn't financialize everything. You didn't blame elderly people if they didn't have enough money to live on for not saving enough. You thought, oh, how terrible, we should raise the age pension. Those kind of things. It's been a deliberate campaign, and we have to fight back. We don't want to have to go through not just a pandemic, but 2 world wars and God knows what else, a terrible climate crisis before we fight back. And the great thing to do is not to despair, but to get educated, which is what Real Progressives is all about, which is marvelous, and then to get active and to organize and to campaign and have not just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in Washington, D.C., or people like her or even more progressive than her, but dozens of them. I'm very hopeful about the future. I think that the pendulum is going to swing back. I just don't know when.
We are doing our best here to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Roseanne has a question.
Hi, Stephen. It's
Hi,
Roseanne.
Rose.
How you doing? Thanks
I
so much.
I still remember dancing with you.
Yes, I do. I do too. Thank you, my dear. You know, I wanted to know, students in your classes, in Phil Lawn's classes, do they come to you with some kind of activism, or do you feel that once they are looking at how economies, monetarily fiat sovereign economies work, do you think they tend to be more active, go out there and, you know, really get pumped up by this now that you've turned them on?
More than they did even 5 years ago. I've noticed things changing, and some of that is down to climate change activism and Greta Thunberg and the school climate strike and all that. Of course, it's not all about climate change, but that has got a lot more young people interested in progressive economics and what we can do to address the many crises we're faced with. Climate change is just one of them. Of course, inequality is another one, all those deficits that Stephanie was talking about. I get the great opportunity of teaching people on a big first year course. So I don't, it's been marvelous in the last year or two to see people engage with these kind of problems more than before. And I also think I get an opportunity to immunize them a little bit for when they do some more conservative economics classes later on, so that they understand what's wrong with it. They understand how people can be influenced by the mainstream conservative approach to thinking about economics. But of course, like in the US, they're under a lot of stress too. Unlike when I was a student, coming to university isn't free. They have to pay fees. They end up with a debt they've got to deal with afterwards. We have a tremendous property bubble in Australia. So if they want somewhere to live, even if you're renting, but especially if in the future you want to buy a home, that's going to be really expensive too. And they have to earn money during the while they're doing the degree as well. So when I run events for activists, they do tend to be people my age or older very often, most of them. That's because they're the people with the time. For young people these days, the financialization, the pressures we've put them under, squeeze them so much that it's very difficult for them to find the time to be activists the way that people of my generation or the generation before mine might have been, in the late 60s and the 70s and the early 80s.
I think it's done on purpose, though, in a way that you suck the life out of people and they don't have time to organize.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it's so important to have free college education, not just for people on low incomes either. We just don't want anyone coming out of going to university or other further or higher education with a big debt they're carrying around with them. That's just not the kind of society that we want to have. We want to give people time when they're young to think about the world and think about important issues and get involved in campaigning. That's part of a healthy society, I think. And it's one of the many things we've lost, which we need to take back.
Yeah, and also everybody should have the opportunity to go. People shouldn't say, "Oh, well, I don't have the money, so I can't get an education. So now I'm stuck, at a job that's not a career, and my potential is so much more than this."
And that's where inequality, the more inequality you get, the less social mobility you get too. There's a graph called the Gatsby curve, which is about basically the idea that in more unequal countries, and there are many things I love about the US, but your level of inequality isn't one of them. It's even worse than in Australia. Basically, the US isn't in the first world group of countries as far as inequality is concerned. It has much higher levels of inequality than other rich democracies do. Once you've got that kind of level of inequality, the rich pull the ladder up, basically. And so if you start off with a low level of income and it's really expensive to go to college, you can't afford to go there, and you may not get in anyway, because Stephanie in the chapter was talking about how schools are funded in the US, and how schools are funded in America depends on the resources of the financial resources of the local authorities, who of course are not monetary sovereigns. In Australia, we've got a system where in lower income areas, they get more money. You don't seem to have that in the US. So you're going to go to an underfunded school, and even if you somehow manage to come out of there doing well enough to go to college, you're not going to be able to afford to go to college. What kind of chance have you got? And then you might end up in a minimum wage job. Now, when I went to the first MMT conference in Kansas City a couple of years ago, I got into a discussion with a taxi driver, really intelligent woman, who must have been 35 or 40, I guess. And I discovered that she had never in her life earned the Australian minimum wage. Our minimum wage in US dollar terms, once you add in contributions to retirement savings and leave and stuff like that, it comes out a little bit less than $20 US an hour. She'd never earned anything remotely at that level. And so she was doing 3 jobs. And how, even if she's going to learn about something like modern monetary theory, where's she going to find the time and the energy to come and get involved in real progressives or stand as a candidate? It's just impossible for people. That's where, as I said, Steve Grumbine setting this up, and all you guys, you're doing a fantastic job, and we just have to keep pushing. We are getting a bit further. Everybody's heard, at least amongst policymakers, they've all heard about modern monetary theory now, and maybe it'll take until the next generation. Maybe it's not all going to happen tomorrow, but I think we're planting a tree when we do things like this event now. And hopefully it will grow, and we will get to the point where we push back and the Friedman-Reagan revolution gets reversed, and we end up with the kind of society that we could have and we ought to have. Other than places like Luxembourg and Monaco, the US has the highest income per head in the world. You can afford to send people to college without fees, without them incurring student debt. You can afford to have a decent healthcare system Actually, you could do it, I mean, that's another point entirely, you could do it more cheaply than you are having your not decent healthcare system at the moment, as you know more than I do. But there is so many things that can be achieved. There are so many, to use the word at the end of Stephanie's chapter, opportunities. If you could have a genuinely progressive federal government, and the new president is going to be a lot more progressive than the old one, but I'm not in a position to comment on the priorities. And if you could have Congress filled with people who, they don't have to talk about modern monetary theory, they just have to have absorbed it and understood it.
Yes, that would, Jabari has a question, but that would mean that they wouldn't be in the pocket of big business. And
well, those politicians have to lose elections. That's a hard one.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Jabari, welcome.
Wait, my question was, what options does the administration have in order to deal with student debt?
Well, I'm not I'm not in the US, but I can tell you what options the Australian government would have to deal with student debt. The government could just write off the debt. They can repay debts held in the private sector. In Australia, the government itself is the major creditor where student debt is concerned, and they could just write it off, take it onto the government's balance sheet. The federal government is a monetary sovereign with a fiat currency. It isn't going to run out of US dollars in the case of the US. It wouldn't be something inflationary. It would take a huge burden of people's shoulders, and at the same time, tuition in public colleges and universities ought to be free of charge as well. And what I'm saying there, and of course, it's what Bernie Sanders campaigned for during his 2 presidential campaigns. It's not really extreme. In the UK, when I was a student, many years ago, it's not this way now. You didn't just go to uni for free. I was paid to go to university. The government paid me not a very high wage, but a wage. It was called a student grant to go to university. It was enough to live on. That is the way university worked in the second half of the 1970s and first half of the 1980s in the UK. It didn't bankrupt the government. It did mean that ordinary people without a high level of income could afford to go to university, and they could concentrate on their studies. They didn't have to flip burgers if they didn't want to spend too much. Now, we're not even asking for that. We're just saying the student debt should never have been incurred in the first place. I know some people have struggled to pay off their student debts, but I think those that have done that, we shouldn't want to wish on the next generation what we had to go through. Student debt should be forgiven, and there is no reason. The US has the real resources to do this. There's no reason to expect it to be inflationary. There's no reason why public colleges and universities couldn't be tuition cost free. And indeed, there is a careful study done of the implications in the US of eliminating student debt by Stephanie and some of her colleagues at the Levy Institute. If you go on the Levy Institute site, they went through the econometrics of it, and they showed that it wouldn't be inflationary, that it would be good for the economy. It's just something that ought to be, I don't really like this term, but you hear people use it a lot. It ought to be a no-brainer. A rich country like the US should not have student fees, and it shouldn't have high levels of student debt. And there are plenty of countries in Europe where there are not student fees. Even in the UK, in Scotland, if you're a Scottish resident, you don't pay to go to university. It's free, for example. America's much richer than Scotland.
My parents were born in Iran, and my parents went to university for free 50 some odd years ago, but more 60 some odd years ago.
The happiest countries in the world are places like Norway and Finland And in these countries, higher education is free of charge. And these countries are not richer than the USA.
Absolutely. Raul has a question.
Good evening, Ramona, and good afternoon, Stephen. My question is, how can public education, and I'm saying more, I guess, in a U.S. context, but maybe more broadly, K-12, be prioritized when it's mostly a state and local responsibility, given that states, counties, and towns are currency users, not currency issuers?
Well, there is nothing stopping the federal government making grants to US states, and presumably they do that. That's what happens in Australia. In Australia, schools are states' responsibilities, but these states receive some funding from the federal government based on something from a few years ago called the Gonski Report here, which was about dealing with the fact that schools in areas of relative deprivation were under-resourced. And it's not perfect, but they're not as under-resourced as they used to be because of the way it's funded. But I think the implication of your question is entirely right, that the funding to do this needs to come from the federal government.
Yes.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, go on, Ramona, finish.
No, please, go ahead.
Okay, so Stephen, I think I heard from you first the concept of, I think Phil Long's concept of a genuine progress indicator or index. And I find it really intriguing, and I think people who don't know what it is would be interested. But could you start by kind of explaining basically what the gross domestic product measures? Because it doesn't necessarily measure positive things. It measures things like debt interest and stuff, right?
Well, we are sort of getting a little bit away from MMT, but yeah, absolutely. Gross domestic product in the USA simply measures all the spending taking place on goods and services produced in the USA, whether those goods are good for the environment or not. And for example, if there is a terrible environmental disaster and a lot of money has to be spent on clearing up that environmental disaster, that's obviously not improving people's well-being, but it does increase gross domestic product. Since you ask, and this is something that I dealt with in my book a couple of years ago. I have a book called Economics for Sustainable Prosperity. When you look at all sorts of measures of what it means to be a successful society, including doing something just as simple as asking people on a scale from 0 to 10 how happy they are. GDP per person matters a lot in poor countries. But once you get beyond about the income of Spain or Korea, once you get into rich countries, and the US is almost the richest country, then it doesn't matter at all. There's no link at all between people's mental health or life expectancy or how happy they are with life or how much they trust their neighbors or the crime rate or the number of people in prison or all those things that we might like, and GDP in rich countries. What matters much, much more is inequality. More successful societies amongst rich countries are the more equal ones. And that's why on a range of metrics that we could go through if I had the statistics in front of me, the Scandinavian countries in particular just do better than elsewhere. Places like Finland, they have far less inequality. They have better healthcare. They have a better education system. They have fewer people in prison. America has more people in prison than anyone else, more than China. And China has, 3 times the population of the US, for example. So, Phil's genuine progress indicator has been used quite often in the US, and indeed the government of Vermont, just thinking about Bernie Sanders, uses the state genuine progress indicator, as a guide to policy formation. The genuine progress indicator includes a range of economic variables, including consumption per person, but also inequality. But it also includes a whole series of social variables as well. I can't remember all of them now, but things like crime rates, divorce rates, etc., and ecological measures too, environmental statistics as well, and it weights them all, and it comes up with $1 figure, which if policymakers are obsessed with having a single statistic to base their policy decisions on, people like Phil and the American economist Robert Costanza would argue is a better target to have than GDP. I also like the approach of an ecological economist called Kate Raworth, who wrote a famous book called Donut Economics about 4 years ago now, where she doesn't have a single indicator at all, but a panel. So she would identify, if we want Americans to thrive, what statistics should we be looking at for inequality and for dealing with the good jobs deficit and the climate deficit, and what statistic is important for infrastructure and for healthcare and for education and for the quality of the country's democracy, and set targets for all of those. And I have the government report on each of those, have the president report in his State of the Union address how the country is getting on with all of those important targets. And while at the same time, being an ecological economist, what about carbon emissions? What about land use? What about dealing with the extinction crisis? What about the use of plastics? What about adding too much phosphorus and nitrogen to the soil and the quality of our water, and all these kind of issues? And then you have a whole panel of them, and you ask the politicians every year, maybe they should do this during the budgeting process, to report on how they're doing as far as all those indicators are concerned. And some countries like New Zealand are moving in this direction. And the idea is, if the country's thriving, if there's full employment, if you've got a $20 an hour minimum wage, if all those things are really great, then if GDP is growing, as long as you are moving towards zero net emissions as you need to, as long as you're meeting people's basic needs to have a good life, it really doesn't matter. If GDP happened to fall in 1 year, as long as people were still secure, as long as people were not living in insecurity or poverty or involuntary unemployment or underemployment, it really wouldn't matter. GDP, a bit like the government's budget position, would just come out. It would be something that you wouldn't target. It would be whatever it needed to be in order to create a flourishing society living within its ecological limits.
Stephen, that sounds so functional. And here in the US, we have a lot of fear mongering. The fear mongering, like for healthcare, you won't, have an appointment to see your doctor. It'll be too long of a wait. You'll die before you get to see your doctor. A lot of that fear mongering I see. And, here the prison system is actually a business. And so
it is a bit here. It's spreading here too. Just
they
as the
profit off of the bodies.
The US leads the world. It does. Just as the US led the world in many ways in the right direction, although things were far from perfect, between 1945 and the 1970s, it's been leading the world in the wrong direction. And Australia is one of those countries that's been following. We have private prisons here too. We have private detention centres for migrants. We've moved a little bit towards the US healthcare system over time, madly, because you spend more than twice as much per person as us on healthcare. But whereas our life expectancy is nearly 84, yours is less than 79. So why we would want to privatize our healthcare system and move towards more and more reliance on health insurance when we had a perfectly good, and still have the remnants of it, free at the point of need healthcare system in Australia, Well, I was going to say I don't know, but of course I do know. It's that state capture. It's the people who benefit. There are people who do very, very well out of the way the world works at the moment, and they don't want us to change it. We're going to change it anyway because there's going to end up being more of us than them.
There's already more of us than them. We just need to take our power back.
That's right.
Jules has a question. Hi, Jules.
Hi. I was going to have you read it for me, but I can't miss the opportunity to ask it myself. So I work, when I'm not working for RP, I work for a company that is like a supplier for a lot of the oil and gas industry. And so like for me personally, that's a big conflict of interest. And as we've seen like the global shutdown, and we saw a lot of positive impact from not using fossil fuels and people not traveling so much. And like there were a lot of really very obvious things, you know, clearer skies and cleaner water and stuff in certain areas. My question is kind of two-part. So how do we use what we saw when everything shut down to show that we can make, you know, such a big impact even in such a short amount of time? How do we use that to really push for our, you know, all the countries to do better, knowing that we can have that kind of impact? And then also, do you see the big oil companies, because I see signs of it even now with oil kind of being real low and they're, you know, struggling, that they're investing in some of the, you know, wind energy and the solar and stuff like that. And my fear is that it's a rush to find a way to make as much profit as possible and still have the huge wealth inequality, because like there's nothing happening in between to sort of prevent that from happening. So what do you see in the future? I like your positive outlook, so I'm hoping that you'll have some for this too.
I get where you're coming from in terms of conflict of interest. We get plenty of that in Australia. We are the world's biggest coal exporter. We are now also the world's biggest liquefied natural gas exporter. And we have higher, even without taking those exports into account, in terms of what we consume, we have a higher level of carbon emissions per capita than the US does. Indeed, we are second only to Kuwait, believe it or not. We're in the, I'm in the country which has got no reason to be proud. And indeed, our government so far is one of the few high-income country governments not to announce a zero net emissions target year. We haven't announced 2050, and if our government does, it's likely to be because Joe Biden threatens Australia with carbon tariffs. That's how bad we are over here. It's a tremendous challenge to get to zero net emissions, as I'm sure everybody realizes, but 2050, although that in itself is a tremendous challenge, if you want really any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of global warming over pre-industrial levels, is not remotely enough. It might be, if we were lucky, for the whole planet, but of course that means rich countries like yours and mine have to move much faster than that. So we need to be talking about the 2030s, not the 2050s. And then there's the other point that you made, and this fits in with, I read yesterday, or was it the day before, that Shell, the big oil company, is saying we're never going to pump as much oil as we did last year. We're changing over time. We're moving towards renewables. And absolutely, we could get 100% renewable electricity, but everything else still basically neoliberalism, if we're not careful. It has to, the climate crisis, indeed the ecological crisis. I mean, it's made worse by the crisis of inequality, but you could imagine us solving the climate crisis if that's, that in itself is going to be a huge challenge, but you could imagine that happening and us not having addressed all these other issues, all the reasons why there were people storming the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and how come someone like Donald Trump manages to be elected as president in the first place, and how come the Democratic Party is as far to the right in many ways as it has become, and inequality has been allowed to go as far as it has in the US. That's where this has to be part of an overarching mission, and I think Stephanie's chapter dealt with this very well. The climate deficit was only one of those deficits, the inequality deficit. When you talk to politicians, as I hope you will, maybe you'll get AOC on Real Progressives and talk to her. There are measures of inequality like Stephanie was talking about in the chapter, one called the Gini coefficient. Find out about it, find out what Denmark's is, and ask your politicians, if you were in power, how many years would it take you to reduce America's inequality to the level of Denmark? I want you to tell me, and if you're going to be president, if you're President Biden and inequality does not fall every year, why? It's a crisis. If you've got a budget deficit, that's not a crisis. That's normal and natural and usually a good thing. If inequality keeps rising like it has been for 35 years, that's a crisis. Why don't you have a federal minimum wage of $15 is not enough. Don't just accept $15. That's nowhere near enough in a country as rich as the US. It should be towards the $20 mark now. And then your labor laws that were reformed in the early 80s, just to say we're here, how are you going to give people more bargaining power in the workplace? How are we going to deal with the gig economy? The job guarantee will help, but it's not enough on its own. How do we deal with the monopoly power, which the sorts of trade deals that, and this is where there was almost a bit of overlap between the Bernie Sanders and the Donald Trump campaigns that have been done down the decades, which have allowed businesses to ship jobs to low labor cost countries without those low labor cost countries having measures to protect their own workers against being exploited, and to ship dirty industries out of the US. So we've not dealt with issues of pollution. Instead, we've just done the pollution somewhere else, not acting as good global citizens at all. There are so many other things in countries that have low levels of inequality, like the Scandinavian countries. In medium and large businesses, it's compulsory to have ordinary workers on the board of directors. Why not in the US? You can do it in Norway and Finland and Sweden and Germany even, actually. Why not in the US? There's so many things we need to push for. And of course, how are we going to create the space in the US to free up the real resources, to allow us to make the investments we need to make in order to address climate change on all these other issues? You need to get rid of the current healthcare system and to move to something like the British National Health Service, like Bernie was talking about. That will free up enormous resources. Much of what happens on Wall Street is unnecessary and should basically just be banned. I like the Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell approach to talking about financial regulation in this context. That will free up plenty of real resources, space within the economy. And of course, over time, moving away from fossil fuels will do the same thing. Now, where fossil fuels are concerned, it is not the ordinary people that have been working in those industries that need to take responsibility for the impact of those industries on our global environment. They need to be protected, as Bernie was talking about in the election campaign. There are not so many of them that you can't afford to protect them. So maintain their incomes for a period of time, talk to trade unions and local communities about transitions, about, yes, jobs in renewables where those renewable jobs are available, but having other plans in place to enable local communities to transition away from relying on a coal mine or oil production or whatever you have to move away from. And I hope this is going to happen. And all this, well, this is a big mission, isn't it? This is where a recent book by one of Stephanie's friends, Mariana Mazzucato, has just come out, is important. The Mission Economy, it's called. There needs to be an agency in Washington working across government departments, liaising with the states, that says, well, basically, just like JFK in the early 60s, we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade. You say, in the US, by the end of the decade, this is the kind of society and community we're going to create. I'm not entirely sure how we're going to do all of these things just yet. It's going to need some innovations. It's going to need cooperation between the government and the private sector, but we are going to do this and we're not going to leave anyone behind. And I think people would be inspired by that. And that's what I hope is going to happen at some point before too long, because to go back to the beginning of the question and this very long answer again, yes, there is a severe danger that if we look at climate change in isolation, we end up with neoliberalism with windmills. We don't want that. Or I don't want that.
Thank you, Stephen. Bakari, hi. Bakari has a question.
Oh, hi. Hi, good evening. Thanks a lot for letting me in. I'm not sure if I've asked this question before, but I keep thinking about, should we get to the point of removing federal income taxes for low-income workers? I'm definitely, tax the rich because they need to be. They have way too much money and wealth. But I'm just thinking, what's the point of taxing people at a minimum wage or even a little bit above a minimum wage? It just doesn't seem like it's a good idea. I mean, what shouldn't be necessary. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's many ways to cook an egg, isn't there? So if you restructure the tax system so that if you're on the minimum wage, you are not paying income tax, then you don't need the minimum wage to be so high. If you provide lots of services free of charge. So I was talking about the minimum wage in Australia. It's still the case in Australia that if you do get COVID and you go to hospital, then unlike Paul Steve Grumbine, you're not going to get a bill. It's free. If you choose the right doctor, you can go and see your doctor for free. Or if you go, you're only going to pay a few dollars. Anyway, we haven't gone that far down that path. So where there are a variety of important public services which are available to people for free, they don't need so much income. Where the minimum wage is higher, it doesn't matter so much if you're paying a little bit of income tax out of it. You have to take the whole, so I don't have a prescription for you. What matters is where people sit after the tax and welfare system is taken into account. And different countries get to a relatively low level of inequality in different ways. So in the Scandinavian countries, they have quite a lot of inequality actually before taxes and welfare payments, but they have a very redistributive welfare system and progressive tax system. In Korea, the tax system and welfare system isn't very redistributive, but they don't have the same inequality that other countries have before that. Chief executives are not earning such a huge multiple of what ordinary people make. So there's a variety of ways to get there. MMT people often talk about pre-distribution and redistribution, don't they? Well, and they say pre-distribution is better, and it may be more sustainable, but actually what matters in the end is that there is not a huge degree of inequality. And I would be saying to a US Democratic president and administration, if I had the opportunity to do so, I don't care how you get there, but I want a situation where there's nobody living in poverty in the US, where everybody lives in economic security, where we've not left anybody behind, and where at least we get back to the 1970s level of inequality. And actually, we ought to do much better than that. We should be aiming for best practice And best practice in inequality is a Scandinavian level of inequality. Why not aim for that?
Stephen, what is the point of taxing somebody who's like middle or low income? Is there a point to it?
We usually go through a variety of motivations for taxation, don't we, when we talk about MMT, and you would have done that in previous weeks. So you would have talked about tax liabilities creating a demand for the government's currency in the first place. And
Right.
you would have talked about the tax system for redistributive purposes, which Stephanie mentioned in her book. And you would have talked about taxing bads and not taxing goods to try and stop people smoking as much or putting as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But one of the reasons that we pay taxes, of course, is to limit the spending power of the private sector in order to create room within the productive capacity of the economy for non-inflationary government spending. And there is that awkward fact that when you tax people on, let's say, middle incomes, they actually do spend less as a result. So if you were up against the full employment ceiling in the US at the moment, and there was a risk of demand pull inflation, well, actually taxing the rich, it helps you with getting a distribution which is just, but they don't cut back on the amount they spend all that much when you tax them more. So it's not as effective in that area. That having been said, the US is, and this was true even before the pandemic, is a long way away from demand pull inflation. So yeah, good question. I don't know enough about the US tax system to be able to say more than that, but you might well argue for a system where somebody on the minimum wage was not subject to federal income taxation and it only kicked in above that federal minimum wage. Good argument, but as I've said, I don't know enough about it really. And there's a variety of ways of getting to the society that we'd like to create.
Lael has a question.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping this is related to MMT. I think they say, I've heard it said that FDR saved capitalism. But you know, he infused the economy with a huge infrastructure mobilization, and which I think we need again. In fact, I'm sure of it. But there's so much resistance to thinking that that is socialism, and yet, so I guess I just always get stuck on how to get over that mythology that it's I mean, I'm not opposed to it if there are socialistic elements at all, but there's resistance to that, and I just wonder if you might speak to how we can overcome that resistance, given that, you know, actually it's a system that boosts everybody as long as we're playing fair, sort of. Thank you.
I think we should be getting beyond talking about terms that come out of the 19th century. Capitalism, socialism, people obsess about these things all the time, and you hear people say, should we reform capitalism or replace it? And then you ask them what capitalism is. And if you ask 5 people what it is, you get 5 different, sometimes contradictory answers, really. And how long have we had capitalism? If it's about money and markets, it's at least 5,000 years old. If it's about what the anthropologist Jason Hickel talks about as enclosure and exploitation and colonialism, it maybe goes back to about Christopher Columbus. If it's about the Industrial Revolution and the wealth of nations and people talking about laissez-faire economics, it goes back to about the same time the US does, 1776 or 1750 or something. If it's about big monopolistic industrial organizations, it goes back to about the 1870s. I don't even know what capitalism is, really. If it's the 1870s version, we certainly have to do something about that, because that drives us towards growing inequality and ecological unsustainability. If it's about having, like in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, the famous book, he talks about a baker and a butcher and a brewer all working in their own interests, but while they're working in their own interests, serving the interests of the community as a whole. Well, we weren't talking about one of those firms becoming Microsoft or Ford or General Motors or anything. These were small traders, and they'll be part, that sort of thing will be part of a future community. But there's no such thing as a free market. All markets have rules and regulations behind them. There's no such thing as a monetary system without a tax collecting central government that said rules and regulations. The modern US government has a budget, which takes up 20% of your GDP. Singapore, that famously capitalist country, is a country where most people rent housing from the government, and where the government owns the big airline and lots of other businesses too. So I'm not even clear what capitalism and socialism is all about. I know that the future and building a better economy will be about the government and the private sector cooperating to create the kind of future that we want. Now, that cooperation should not be dominated by big monopoly capitalists or super rich people on Wall Street. But on the other hand, we're not going to have everyone working for the government either. It's a mix of the two. And I'm not sure that it's all that helpful to keep talking about the isms of the 19th century. We're in the 21st century. We need to think about the 22nd century and everybody's great-grandchildren and the future that we'd like to see them have. Maybe that's not a very good answer, but it's the best answer I could think of.
That is going to happen very soon. Idaho has a question. Welcome, Idaho.
I'd be interested in Virginia's view as well after that question. As a socialist, I have a different view.
Okay.
But go on. So let's have the question first.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Nice. I'm all right. How are you?
So it was before I posed this question before I realized it was the Australia-US issue. But anyways, it's a question that bothered me for a long time, and it's about states' within the US ability to get loans or borrow money. Can they do it through commercial banks instead of bonds, as the bond market might not have the interest as low as banks? You see what I mean? If they can get a cheaper loan in the bank, why would they issue a bond?
They can, but they usually can borrow more cheaply by issuing bonds than borrowing from banks. It's not usually that way around. And with some banks, some state governments may have better credit ratings than the banks do.
Right. So perfect. And I just have another question. That some small thing that you said before about the Mosler Mitchell Stock Exchange regulation ideas. If you can just have a short answer about that too.
In terms of the banks, then Warren would make the banks very narrow in terms of what they do, so that they create credit. They decide who to lend to, and they run the payment system in concert with the central bank, but they don't get heavily involved in taking risks which might contribute towards rising financial instability and potentially a financial crisis like 2008. If Warren was in charge, then securitization, private securities where banks take mortgage loans and sell them on to investors so that the banks then don't have to worry about who they create those mortgages for and what risks they're taking on. That would become unlawful. And many of the derivatives that are traded on Wall Street that don't have an obvious economic argument in terms of managing risks for businesses, for example, but instead are really more about gambling, would just be illegal. That's what they do, and you know, if you did that, you'd have a smaller and less influential financial sector. The financial sector grew hugely in countries like the US, really from the late 1960s onwards, but then had a huge boost when finally Glass-Steagall, which was in that little video of the movie that was repealed, along with a couple of other measures at the end of the 1990s under Bill Clinton. And that led to a lot more irresponsible risk-taking in the early 2000s. That fed in eventually to the global financial crisis. And we weren't far off having another Great Depression, actually in 2008. So yeah, we want to get rid of all of that. And actually a lot of the people currently trading in derivatives on Wall Street, they were doing something useful with their lives. Those are real resources that could be deployed elsewhere in the economy. More importantly, future generations are super brainy people going through you've got some of the world's best universities in America. We've got better things for them to do with their lives than work in investment banking institutions on Wall Street. We've got some big problems to address, which don't involve coming up with clever mathematical formulas relating to options valuation models and stuff like that. Much more important things to do.
You would have to make it worth their while. That's what I see, and that's why they're in the stock market and investment banking.
Well, we'd make it worth their while by making some of their jobs illegal, so they wouldn't really have much of a choice over that. But,
that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Virginia, would you like to kindly disagree and state your case?
Oh,
Go ahead.
This is so far away from MMT. I think we should table it for another time.
Okay.
Yes.
That's all right. You might find we just mean different things by the word socialism.
Well, that's possible. No,
Often.
I am a historical materialist, very traditional Marxist, and so I don't believe that history can turn around. I think that capitalism was very progressive at first, just like all systems are. Feudalism was progressive over the slave system that existed before it, etc. That's all I'm saying. So the idea that we could go back to an FDR type of situation just doesn't compute for me.
I agree with you on that. That's not really what I was talking about, but perhaps I wasn't expressing myself very clearly. I think we need to create something new. Yeah. And that's where addressing all these myths and having at the center of government coming up with a mission statement, having a vision about what sort of society we want to create. And then the great thing about modern monetary theory is we then say, you know what, it's not a problem finding the dollars to do this vision. What we need to do is a real resource audit. We know the kind of future we want to create in 10 years' time. Now, what labor and skills and capital equipment and technology and infrastructure and natural resources and institutional capacity do we have now? And what can we free up? And where we haven't yet got things in place to make the investments that we need to make in order to create the kind of society that we want to bequeath to the next generation, then how could we build that capacity? And all the time, as Stephanie says earlier in the book, what we're doing if we're the Congressional Budget Office is we're not worrying ourselves out of context. about what the federal deficit is going to be, but instead we are looking carefully at the elements in the chosen measure of inflation, the core personal consumption expenditure index. I think that's the one that the Fed uses, and we're just looking for the risk that inflation might take off. And if we think it's a problem to do with monopoly power, then we deal with that. If we think that there is a bottleneck where our productive capacity won't allow us to move quickly to create the kind of society we want to create, then we need to address that and make investments on that basis. And it's about being positive and going back to the last word in the chapter again, looking at our opportunities for what we can create. And I don't care if you call it a brand of socialism or a brand of capitalism, because I think we've got beyond those things. I don't know what it is. It's not communism either. But it's the future that we want to create.
I agree. And the reason I hope that you're right, and if that's why I'm hanging out with you guys, ever since I discovered MMT, I've been trying to make it work in my head. So thank you.
That's all right. Find a 35-year-old Bernie, or maybe AOC will be that, maybe it'll be somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to get them into the White House. I mean, if we're still going to have presidents at all, we need to get someone like that into the White House, and you need lots of young, diverse people that look like the country that they're representing, that understand MMT and have all these values, which would be so great when it comes to changing the system. We need them in place too, because actually, if we're going to change the world, we need the US to lead it.
Okay, I will ask for Curtis. Okay. So
thanks, Curtis. Yeah, go ahead.
Climate change has already redefined what is a refugee, and the conflict and despair from climate change will only continue to increase conflict. Can you take MMT out of the nation state and apply it to trans-border processes? Are there models where intergovernment or international organizations have an impact or place?
Okay, that's a big question, and it is one that Stephanie addresses a little bit, well, quite a lot actually, in chapter 5 of the book on rethinking trade. There's many things I think that need to happen. Our trade deals around the world have been negotiated in secret, apart from the only people that have been in those negotiations, other than senior public servants and politicians, have been the big multinationals, the elite. And those deals, basically, they've not been about free trade. They've been about rules to do with things like intellectual property in order to protect the interests of the elite. And that needs to change. And I was quite depressed by Africa has just started the first Pan-African free trade area deal. It was launched last month. Is it going to make things better? Not a lot better, because it's the same kind of thing all over again. It's a set of rules supposed to encourage more trade between African countries, which is great. But again, it's in the interest of the almost exclusively non-African rich elite and the multinationals that they manage and own. The developing countries, newly independent developing countries, did pretty well in the 1960s and 70s. Those were the development decades until the oil price spike of the mid-70s. But in order to introduce what were often very progressive policies, rolling out healthcare and basic education to people where they hadn't existed before, and doing other things too, they needed imported technology and energy, and they borrowed US dollars. And the way you borrowed US dollars in those days was at a variable interest rate. Then came along early 1980s, monetarism, Reagan, massively high US interest rates, and global recession. So those countries were hit with interest rates they never expected to have to pay on the dollars that they borrowed, at the same time as their export markets collapsed. And there was nearly a global banking crisis in the early 1980s. Their debts were rescheduled, but their debts were eventually rescheduled during the 1980s under the Reagan and Bush administrations, based on them all signing up to the Washington Consensus, which was basically global neoliberalism, which was agreeing to trade deals whereby you let all the multinationals in, you let them take out whatever money they wanted to take out, you didn't regulate them at all, you didn't have local ownership or technology transfer, you made investments in their interests, you didn't make them hire people, locals at high levels within the organizations. You basically let these rich countries extract, companies from rich countries extract enormous amounts of wealth. And at the same time, of course, they were shipping jobs from the US, where people have been well paid, and Britain and other places, to low-income countries where they were exploiting people who were being paid minimally. It was disastrous. All this we have to undo. On top of undoing this, we have to deal with the fact that places like the US and Australia and Europe have benefited hugely from slavery and from colonialism, and we have created the climate crisis. They haven't created it in Africa, we've created it. It's not created in poor Asian countries, we've created it. So a really progressive future US president would lead world negotiations about how the rich countries would take on much more responsibility in terms of dealing with climate change and the ecological crisis than they have so far. And at the same time, they would provide technology and expertise freely in terms of helping countries around the world move towards energy and food self-sufficiency, and as far as energy self-sufficiency was concerned, renewable energy. But on top of that, instead of, as happens now, $5 trillion going from the poor countries to the rich countries every year, and only $3 trillion going in the other direction. So the aid doesn't go, once you take everything into account, doesn't go from the rich to the poor. We don't give them aid, it's the other way around. Because of the way that we exploit our relationship with them, we're taking resources out of them every year. We need to reverse that, and we've got to, just as with our own people, we need to make reparations. And I'm in Australia, where First Nations people here have been dreadfully treated for 200 years. And that needs to be addressed. But we also have to address the fact that Europe and North America and Australia and some other countries have got rich off the back of African and sometimes South American and low-income Asian countries. We need to look at all these things. This, I'm afraid, is something which I am less optimistic about than some of the other things I discussed, because it's a really, really difficult global conversation. Low-income countries, however, will have more freedom from an MMT perspective over time if they can move towards a situation where they are less vulnerable to currency depreciation if they had floating exchange rates. And that means moving towards, as I was just mentioning, and Fadel Kaboub often talks about this, food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. And that is something in many countries which you could afford to do using a job guarantee, which is the sort of thing that Fadel has tried to campaign for, not just in Tunisia, but across lots of countries in the last few years. So there are a lot of insights from MMT, but of course the big problem is if you're in many of these low-income countries at the moment, you don't have much monetary sovereignty. You have to try and build it over time, and the rich countries should be trying to help the poor countries do that.
So if these poorer countries were able to sustain themselves without having to export or import, or mostly import, goods to be able to sustain themselves, then they could, in an essence, kind of cut themselves off from outside countries if they chose to, and not have all of their wealth extracted from them?
Well, it does mean if your currency depreciates, if you are food self-sufficient, then the cost of food to ordinary people isn't going to suddenly increase. Because at the moment, many countries that used to be self-sufficient in food, because of what we've done to them over the last generation or two, have moved away from that. They now buy imported food priced in US dollars. If their currency depreciates against the US dollar, the local currency cost of food, if you're poor and you don't have access to the land, goes up a lot. So, and the same thing is true if you import oil at the moment, it's priced in US dollars. You can't as easily deal with the possibility that if you had a floating exchange rate because you wanted to pursue policies based on monetary sovereignty, that if that exchange rate depreciated significantly, the cost of living of people at the bottom of society would increase by a lot. I should say, by the way, you said not being so dependent on imports and importing a lot. They generally have trade surpluses, but we take the money out of them through repatriated profits and interest on debt that we persuaded them to take out in the past, and other sneaky things like the use of clever transfer pricing to avoid tax liabilities. If the African countries could get together, they would have a huge amount of bargaining power with the rest of the world, because many of the things we rely on to make our mobile phones work and other stuff are largely found in these countries. There's a great video by somebody called Malin Bart Williams, I think, from Ivory Coast, a TED Talk, where at one point she's talking to an audience of Europeans, and she said, I've been to some of the top universities in the world, but I can't answer this question. Why is it that all the natural resources you need are in our country and not in yours? And yeah, you're so rich and we're so poor. It's because we've been exploiting these countries on and off for a couple of 100 years.
Guess it's time for them to put their foot down.
Not so easy to do. It's time for progressives to think, just as we quite rightly talk about reparations in the US, for example, to people of African-American heritage, or to people who are First Nations people in the US and in Australia too. Well, we also need to be thinking about global reparations, because capitalism in part has been a very dynamic system which has raised living standards and transformed people's lives in all sorts of good ways around the world. It's done a huge amount of damage, some of which we've been talking about. And, you know, in part, it's been highly exploitative in many countries, particularly across Africa, where Europeans like me invaded, enslaved, subjected people to colonial rule, divided up the continent in ways that don't make any sense at all, and then just left everybody get on with it, really. And they were just recovering in the early 70s, and then in the early 80s, we jacked up the interest rate on their financing and stopped buying their exports. So we haven't always been that helpful. And I think a president like Bernie Sanders would have had this kind of vision. Not that Bernie in any ways is perfect, but he did seem to understand some of these things much better than most people do.
He was open enough to care.
Yeah.
That was like the first step. So Christina has a question. Christina, would you like to ask, or should I ask? I'll ask. Many will argue that Scandinavian countries do better because they have less people and there is less diversity. Is there merit to this argument?
I don't know whether the diversity in some of these countries would have been increasing in recent times because they are very open compared to other countries in terms of migration and especially in terms of taking refugees. Is there merit in that argument? I don't think it's population that's the most important thing here. There are plenty of very poor countries in the world with low populations. The US is a very rich country with a high population. I guess that maybe the common cultural heritage and less diversity may have helped in fostering and maintaining the sense of community which underlies progressive policies. But there was some of this in places like the US. I mean, there was terrible racism, of course, and the civil rights movement was very, very necessary and only partially successful. And that's a fight that's by no means won yet. But in some respects, there was more of a sense of community in countries like the US in those decades of optimism and falling inequality and full employment, which lasted from the 40s until the 1970s. And we've lost some of that because of the neoliberal counter-revolution and financializing everything and underemployment, hollowing out the middle class, leaving people to struggle on their own. So I think it's only part of the story.
Perfect. So Alone has a question. Oh, there you are, Alone. You can unmute. Or I can ask it. Oh, here you are. Go ahead.
Need to read my question. Since we know that thank you, Dr. Hale. I've been a huge fan. I think I've sat next to you in one of the presentation and the in Kansas City, Missouri. That was a highlight for me.
Well, thanks very much. If I can just say, when I went to Kansas City, Missouri, I had not properly met Stephanie, and I sat next to her one day, and I was too nervous to say hello.
Likewise.
Anyway, go on.
Sure. So since we know that at the federal level and at the global level, things will take some time. I was wondering if there's something that can be done in the interim at the local level, creating tax credit, local currencies to create job guarantee at the local level and provide for the public purpose, and et cetera, something that activists can work on or push for at their local municipalities, and how would that be structured?
I don't know the legal side of that well enough in the US. You'd have to get Rohan back or Nathan or somebody like that to talk about the creation of local currencies backed by state governments, taking those local currencies back in the payment of taxation. I certainly think that there is room for state governments to look at a limited form of job guarantee, not the MMT job guarantee, but there are many people, I'm sure, in the US, without looking at the statistics, there are many people in Australia who have been long-term unemployed and really need help. Or there are groups of people who are particularly discriminated against or find it very difficult to get into the labour market. And you could certainly, within the resources of a state government, look at the possibility of of running some limited form. It wouldn't be a job. It wouldn't be our job guarantee. But in terms of a comprehensive job guarantee, I'm afraid that has to be funded by the monetary sovereign federal government. I think that even if it was possible to have some form of local currency to increase the fiscal capacity of a state government, I'm not sure that it would stretch as far. Well, certainly you couldn't have an open-ended job guarantee without the federal government behind it, because in a downturn, you'd be suddenly hit with a huge bill. What we've done in Australia to try and get a federal job guarantee over the line is, first of all, I tried to talk to federal politicians and didn't get very far. Then, or not with the ones in the leading major parties anyway. So then we've kind of tried to do it from below. We have tried to use state governments, and we had a little success. The Tasmanian state government, or state parliament, passed a motion mandating the government of Tasmania to at least investigate how you would go about organising a federal job guarantee in Tasmania if the federal government funded it, which is a start. That's the first time we successfully got something through a parliament, which was great. That was that happened last year, pioneered by the leader of the Greens in Tasmania, someone called Cassie O'Connor, but the Labour Party, which is one of the two major parties, fell in behind it. That's how it passed. With our major parties, our equivalent of the Democrats, sort of, is the Australian Labour Party. And what we've been doing with them is we've been working through their state branches and getting motions passed. And we've got to the point now where across most of the country, the young ALP, the young Labour Party branches, have passed motions in favour of a job guarantee. And they are putting pressure from the bottom up on the Labour Party. Now, we have a federal election later on this year or next year, and it's not impossible that the Labour Party might be returned to government. And if they were, it's not impossible, especially if it was close and the Greens held the balance of power, that we might get a federal job guarantee. So whereas the states can't really do an MMT job guarantee, and with its macroeconomic elements and the ability to fund it as well, the way the federal government can, I do think local groups and local community organisations, state legislatures can gradually build pressure. And I think things are moving in the right direction. Are we going to get a federal job guarantee in Australia? I don't know, but there's far more chance now than there was 5 years ago. And in the case of the US, now it wasn't quite our job guarantee, but I did see Kamala Harris as a co-signatory of a job guarantee bill a couple of years ago. If you look it up, not the Bernie AOC version, but there were a number of limited job guarantee bills, and one of them, your vice president was a co-signatory for. So there must be more possibility to push for that now than before as well. And again, you would know much more about this than me, but Joseph Biden's climate change workforce, I used some term from the New Deal, didn't he, for it? I've forgotten now the term. That's, I don't know how that's going to work. I haven't been following it. I've been much more inward looking as far as Australia is concerned in the last year than before. But anything like that, which is a step towards a job guarantee, it just makes the next step a bit easier if we just keep pushing for it. And hopefully we're going to get there. And I think if you introduced a job guarantee in the US and you made it work, and all the other measures we'd like to see work, I think if you were the president, you get re-elected in a landslide. And I think that if the Democrats were to do this ever, for example, I think they'd have control of both houses of Congress for a long time. Whoever does this first is going to be, if they do it right, it's going to be very popular.
I'm not so sure that just by watching and observing, I'm not so sure that in America, the motivation of politics has really become to get reelected and for your party to hold power. It seems almost like it has become a game between, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans of how can we play volleyball and just distract as much as we can so that we can serve the people that are donating to us.
In that case, we need people like you, Ramona, in Washington, D.C.
Yes. Hopefully we'll get a lot of people elected that are just, you know, the average person that cares. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I prefer to be hopeful. It's better to be,
yes.
We may never get anywhere. God forbid that doesn't turn out to be the outcome, but I would much rather try.
Right.
Because there are possibilities. It is not impossible for us to win. I don't know where we'll win first. It wasn't impossible a year ago for Bernie to get elected. I don't believe it was ever impossible. It didn't work out that way. And I just think we have to keep pushing, not just through the Democratic Party in the US, but every way. And if you're in the Democratic Party, don't criticize someone for being in the Greens or socialists. If you're in the Greens or the socialists, don't think everybody in the Democratic Party is an idiot. We're all trying to push, or many of us are, in the same direction. And there is room for intelligent people to disagree on the most effective way of pushing.
Absolutely. Rebecca has a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Rebecca.
Hey, I have a kind of a two-parter question, and I might have asked this one of the last discussions we've had, but this has been a few years now, so it's kind of a two-parter. People like to, I've seen whole threads online, for example, people arguing the merits of nuclear. Oh, it's green energy. And then you got the dissenters saying, yeah, until you have to dispose of the waste, you know, just for example. So, I mean, I guess going off of that, just getting away from econ for a minute, I was wondering, what would be more impactful for us to expand on the technologies we have, like the ones that work now and we know work now, like solar, wind, and so forth? Do we go on to the newer ones that are coming out and see, you know, what problems they hold, or should we just bite the bullet and do both? That's the first part of it. Second of all, what newer ones coming out hold more promise? What would you see coming out that holds promise as far as, you know, doing more impact and saving the planet and the animals and such? And then which ones are just greenwashing, you know, companies using these to say, oh, we're doing a thing, but really it's, you know, padding their bottom line while looking like they're doing something, or worse, it actually has more harmful effects than what they advertise.
Oh, well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rebecca. I am, you know, I'm not an engineer, or that's a difficult question for me to answer. In terms of research, we should, if I was the US president, there would be, I would have gathered together, I'd try and identify all the most able people with the best research skills, and I would bring them together the same way they tried to develop an atomic bomb in the 1940s. And I'd give them more or less an open-ended budget and say, this is what I want you to do. Basically, you're going to save our species, and I almost don't care how much you spend on it, because I think it's hugely important, and the US is the country, not just on its own perhaps, but the US certainly is a country that could afford to do that. In Australia, certainly am opposed to nuclear energy, but Australia is a country which is almost uniquely placed in terms of the potential to generate renewable energy. That's why I am so ashamed that we are the world's biggest exporter of coal. and I think now liquefied natural gas too. I think from people that know about this kind of stuff that I've talked to, I think amongst the technologies which might be transformational, I think that green hydrogen is potentially very, very important. But I think that there's no reason not to research into everything. I wouldn't even be saying in my research body, I wouldn't be saying to anybody, don't research into potentially safe nuclear energy. I'm just extremely skeptical about it. And people I respect tell me that we can have renewable energy, which is reliable, where we don't have blackouts. There are important issues if we're talking about batteries and the lithium or whatever else goes into the battery and where that lithium is coming from and the circumstances under which it's being mined and the ecological damage which is being caused by that. But I don't know the answers to all those questions. I think there are answers to all those questions. Some of them I'm sure exist and I just don't know about. Others, I think, this is going to be a 20-year battle as far as climate change is concerned, and it is going to involve innovations that you and I would not even be able to anticipate. But I just think you have to start off on the journey seriously, in the same way as Stephanie said in her book, they started off on the Let's Fly to the Moon journey. They had no idea how they were going to get there in the early 60s. We do have some idea how we're going to deal with climate change. I think it's important everybody understands what a big challenge it is, because globally in the last year our emissions fell 5% during a pandemic. Now, to give us a 60% chance, 66% chance I think it is, to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees, assuming that we don't trigger any discontinuities as a result of losing all the summer ice in the Arctic, for example. If we've got 20 years or so to get to zero net emissions, maybe a little bit more than that, that's basically the pandemic every year for 20 years. Now that's just ridiculous. I think that it is much harder than people imagine to get to zero net emissions, but we have somehow to get to zero net emissions. I think it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And while I'm not a fan of Bill Gates, he's been in the media the last day or two saying this is the greatest challenge our species has ever faced. And perhaps he's right as far as that's concerned. But all the more reason to have, in countries like the US, a government which has a mission statement in place, which has targets that it's going to aim to meet along the way towards achieving that mission, which shouldn't just be about climate change. As we've said, it should be about building a better future more generally. And it's really important that those governments, especially in countries like the US, are fully informed about their fiscal capacity and about the fact that they really shouldn't be worrying about whether they're balancing the budget. Projections for the US federal deficit over the next 10 years are completely irrelevant, taken out of context. Instead, it is about using our real resources, as we said earlier, to try and achieve those goals that we've chosen to set for ourselves, not just zero net emissions, but far lower levels of inequality and all sorts of other things too. While at the same time keeping inflation low and stable. So we want the economy to be stable, we want to stabilize the climate, and we want social, gender, racial justice.
Amen. Thank you so much.
And someone like
Doctor.
Ramona at the front giving the speech.
I was talking to some activist friends, and they were asking if several of the economists we had on would ever run for office. And I said, you know, I don't really see them running for office, but, you know, they would love for you to run for office so that they can work with you. And, you know, and introduce policy, you know, and work on policy with you. And so, you know, it's so funny how everybody's looking at somebody else and saying, you know, well, this person would be great or that person would be great. And, you know, in reality, you know, if we all came together and supported each other, we'd all be great at it. And we could all be upfront and be leading the way.
Absolutely. The more the merrier.
Yes.
One thing's for sure, I can't stand for office in the US. So.
No. No, but maybe in Australia. You know.
I can't here either, not without giving out my British passport.
Oh, I see.
Yes. Not that it wouldn't be my best. Many of us who are in economics don't have the skills. You do need a particular set of skills to be a successful politician. And not everybody has them, but I think some of the people I've met talking to real progressives down the years definitely do have those skills.
We should encourage them.
I agree with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here, Stephen, and for joining us. And we all so appreciate it.
Well, it's not. I hope everybody stays safe and well.
There's one for each chapter. Go to the media menu and look for the RP Book Club. While you're there, be sure to check out the Macro and Cheese podcast and a wide range of other materials on MMT and other progressive issues. Thanks for joining us.